Morning. Could I welcome you all to today's meeting of the Public Petitions Committee, and as always can remind everyone to switch off any mobile phones or electronic equipment because it does interfere with our sound systems. Agenda item 1, decision on taking business in private. The first item of business seeks the committee's agreement to take item 3 in private. Is the committee agreed that this item should be taken in private? Thank you. Agenda item 2, consideration of current petitions. The next item of business is consideration of current petitions. There are 8 current petitions for consideration today. The first is PE 1403 by Peter Morris on improving support and assistance to victims of crime and their families. Members have a note by the clerk and the submissions. I think members will be all familiar that we had a lot of very, very hard work by Peter Morris and I think some legal students from Aberdeen University who gave an excellent presentation. Mr Morris has been a real advocate for victims' rights, and members may know I've got also some interest in that I moved a Victims Commissioner Bill in the last session, which is sadly no longer with us, but nevertheless the intention I think was good. Mr Morris I think has made some quite critical analysis of the government's views on victims. There is, however, one aspect that Justice will presumably be scrutinising the Victims and Witnesses Bill in due course. I certainly think it would be a shame if the Justice Committee doesn't get the full extent of all the work that we have done. And if the members are agreeable, I would certainly recommend that we refer this excellent petition to Justice so that they can consider it in due course. But I'm open to obviously views from other members. Well, Chet Brodie?
He has written to the Justice Committee, presumably along the same lines as the petition he made here. So I'm just wondering if we're just duplicating what he is currently doing.
Well, I think they will have some information directly. I think in terms of the aspects of how we deal as a committee, we've got a number of choices. We could obviously close the petition, which I'd be very reluctant to do because I don't think it's been fulfilled in terms of what he wishes. We can formally transfer it, and you're right that a lot of the material will have already been received, but formally we still need to transfer this or dispose of it in some way. John Wilson?
Convener, I would agree with yourself in terms of refer this petition on to the Justice Committee as part of their consideration. I know the petitioner has written to the Justice Committee expressing his views, but given the work that this committee has done on the issue, then it might be useful, rather than the Justice Committee duplicating the work, that if we pass on all the paperwork to them, they can then consider in light of the work we have carried out in the past on this issue.
Okay, does any other member wish to contribute? Anne McTaggart?
Just really to agree with John Wilson, I think it's important that we do formally move it on to the Justice Committee to ensure that it's not lost and that good work will be continued.
Yeah, that's my point. It's not going to be lost because he has written it to the Justice Committee and presumably has presented the same information, or we don't know, presented the same information that was presented here. I know we've discussed it, or it has, well, I wasn't there at the time, but it has been discussed. I just wonder, where's the added value in us passing this to the Justice Committee?
I think it's only partial because I think the official record and any other information that we've received will also go on. So what has been passed over by the petitioner is only partial. What we will pass over is the complete record. I think that's the difference. Sorry, Jackson, Carla, did I duplicate your point you were just going to?
Well, in part, Convener, I also felt that by closing the petition, it might by implication appear that in some way we felt that there was no further merit in the suggestion that was being made. And I think actually by passing the petition on, it implies that we think that the issues within it still deserve to be aired within the Justice Committee.
Angus MacDonald?
Thanks, Convener. I totally agree with Jackson Carroll. I think the fact that if we refer it to the Justice Committee, it reinforces the fact that this committee believes that that it does merit further attention.
Any other member wish to contribute? John Wilson?
Part of the reason for referring this on to the Justice Committee, right, and Jackson Carroll is right, we're not closing it, we're referring it on, and that's because the Justice Committee, in terms of its scrutiny of the Victims and Witnesses Scotland Bill, I think the information we have gathered and the evidence we have received in written format will be useful for that committee. As I said earlier, it's about we're assisting the Justice Committee in the process because we've already received evidence from a number of individuals who have contributed to this debate. So it is about trying to make sure the Justice Committee are aware of some of the avenues that this committee has examined and pursued to aid to the discussion for the petitioner, but also hopefully assist the Justice Committee in their deliberations on how to take forward their scrutiny of the bill, proposed bill by the Scottish Government.
And in fairness, my understanding of Mr Morris's assessment is that in lots of ways he's as one with the Scottish Government. That, I think all of us here would want to do a lot more work for victims. I think it's just an interpretation, and it's like, for example, the victim surcharge. He's saying, well, that's fine, but look how much has been paid out to through the legal aid system, and he's trying to get the balance right in these issues. And so I think it's just, there's a lot of it is just about points of detail, and I'm sure the Justice Committee will do this in a lot more detail than we can possibly achieve. I do take Bridge's point. It's just the broader point is there's a lot more we can refer on than just allowing the petitioner himself to do it. Is that agreeable overall? Thank you for that. So the second petition today is PE 1433 by John Hancock on productive land for landless Scots to grow their own food. Members have note by the clerk and the submissions, and members will know that the government is currently looking at a lot of initiatives in this area through the Community Empowerment and Renewable Bill. Again, it would seem sensible to refer to what I assume will be the lead committee as the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. Is that agreeable? Jackson Carla?
Perverse and take the opposite view on this occasion, in the sense that I do think that since the government are responding directly to many of the issues raised, and that there are opportunities and have been opportunities for direct contribution to have been made by both the petitioner and the wider public on these matters, that on this occasion I don't know that it is necessary we refer it on, and it might have been perfectly sensible to close the petition. I don't feel there is the same body of work or evidence underpinning it that our referring it on does meaningfully assist the lead committee in its work.
Can I ask John Wilson? I know Mr Wilson's taken a big interest in this.
I've declared an interest in the past on this issue, and I will also declare as a member of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. The committee has spent some time in terms of its inquiry, particularly stage 3 of its inquiry into public sector reform. We have recently heard evidence from local communities about how they can engage in delivering services for local areas. And one of the issues that has come up, and we heard as a committee, was the issue about community growing land, waste areas of ground that the community could be passed on to allow them to set up allotments and other initiatives to allow local people to grow local produce. So I would suggest to the committee that we actually refer it on to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee as part of its wider consideration of community engagement and regeneration in the wider sense, and just to give it another argument towards looking at empowering local communities. And I think Grow Your Own is one of these areas where I think community empowerment could be quite advantageous and allow local communities to really, and I hate to say this, a grassroots level, engage in community initiatives that would see real benefits in many communities throughout Scotland.
Thank you for that. Can I have views from other members? So just for Adam Ingram, we're currently debating the John Hancock issue. This, as you know, is being discussed in the part of the Community Empowerment Renewable Bill. So the arguments are really, we close this because he's already put his contributions to the committee, or we refer it on to local government, who will be, I assume, the lead committee. Okay. Angus MacDonald?
Yeah, I think given that the Scottish Rural Development Programme is still being looked at by the Agriculture, Food and Rural Communities section, I think it would maybe give some more power to the argument if it is referred to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee in order to allow them to further investigate whether the SRDP programme can be this initiative can be incorporated in the SRDB programme.
Officials were suggesting that in the next programme this may well be an eligible programme for it, so I think that's really interesting. Right, thank you. Amit Taggart, your view on how we should proceed?
I'll declare an interest as being part of the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. I think it would be important to refer it over to there, just to give it an insight of the work that has been done there. But I also hear what Jackson Carlow had said. But I think it offers more weight to the subject, and I think the Local Government and Regeneration Committee would welcome such an input.
Chick Brodie, do you have a view? Right. I think on balance, Mr Carlow, we'll go to the Local Government Committee, but I do understand the point you've made, and thank you for that. So we're referring this to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee. Third camp petitions PE 1438 by Lindsay Patty on improving services for people with mental illness. Members of the note by the clerk and the submissions. I thought that, again, this was a very, very useful petition, and members who were here on Friday will recall that the Youth Parliament made the same point as well about the role that young people have in accessing health services. It certainly would seem sensible that we continue this and ask the Scottish Government to give us some views on the concerns we've received about children and adolescents in terms of receiving help from health services. One thing that struck me, and I think this was made by Lindsay Patty, was I hadn't actually realised that the referral times are different between young people and adults. It's for mental health services, it's 26 weeks for young people, and it's 18 weeks for adults. So I was just surprised there was a difference between adults and young people, because I think in terms of issues to do with the United Nations Convention of Rights of Children, for example, normally you wouldn't expect to distinguish in the way you target services. But that's just a general point I had, and I just want to throw it open to members and get the view. Adam Ingram?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons for that particular is a historic reason, in the sense that children and adolescent mental health services have been underinvested in for a considerable length of time. So I think in terms of writing to the Scottish Government for its views, I think we should be asking specifically about access to CAM services in particular, and to what extent progress has been made and still has to be made. Also, in terms of how best practice is embedded in NHS boards, there has been a significant improvement in mental health services in the last decade or so, but clearly from the evidence we've received that practice is still inconsistent across the country. So we need to see how the Scottish Government's view on how well health boards across the country are actually providing the service that we're seeking. And in relation to that, to what extent talking therapies as opposed to medication has been the order of the day. Because one of the big criticisms of mental health services was that we didn't have enough psychologists, and the use of cognitive behavioural therapy in primary services was the exception rather than the rule. And we need to establish, I think, just both the pace and the direction of travel that we're making. So there are issues here.
I think that's a very good point. It just occurred to me as well, if we're talking about lack of access to psychology services across Scotland, that may well come into our inquiry, which Rob's going to talk about later on today. Jackson Carlow?
I agree with the points made by Adam Ingram. However, one thing I just think we should be careful about generalising is I attended a presentation that took place last Tuesday evening in Parliament on adult mental health services. And we can generalise, I think, adult mental health services, because mental health services for the elderly appear to be worse than even the service that we're looking at here in relation to young people. So the adult service generalises, I think, a very wide age band, and the issue of the lack of provision extends beyond just young people to elderly people too. In no way devalues the petition, but I think it maybe slightly creates the false impression that young people are disadvantaged compared to all adults, when in fact elderly adults are equally disadvantaged by the system.
The point be made more widely then, we have to be careful about age discrimination.
Yes.
Right. Thank you. Other colleagues?
Just in support of what Adam was saying, I mean, in looking at the letters from Lothian, Fife and Borders, they're all making doing various improvement reviews. I just wonder how much cross-pollination and exchange there is of information to achieve best practice. Some of it looks as if there's a consistency, but in other areas, it would suggest that perhaps the communication isn't as thorough as it might be.
So, but there is these heat targets, isn't there, that to try and raise services, and then what we found in other areas, not least insulin pumps, is where the Scottish Government feels that there's a lack of action. They tend to send out these chief executive letters, don't they, to reinforce action that really has to happen, immediately. Thank you. Other colleagues wish to comment? Are colleagues happy then that we continue this to write to the Scottish Government, particularly in the terms that Adam Ingram has outlined? John Wilson?
Could you suggest and declare an interest in the issue, given I'm a member of a cross-party group in mental health in the Parliament? I think the issues Jackson Carlos raised is quite interesting, along with Adam Ingram, in terms of the wide differences in terms of response and referral times for young people and older adults. It might be useful if we include that issue with any correspondence we send to Scottish Government to seek clarification on the heat targets and why the heat targets differ so widely between what would be seen as an adult response time as opposed to a young person or older person's response time in terms of delivery of services. Because I think clearly mental health issues, I would say particularly for young people, we have to be seen to be responding a lot quicker because of the debilitating impact a mental health issue can have on a young person and the continuation on through the rest of their life. So it is about trying to make sure the government are aware that it may be an examination of the heat targets, or the heat targets have to be reviewed to ensure that we're actually getting consistency across the delivery of the service, not only in terms of the age range, but across the health board areas as well.
Thank you. Jackson Carlo?
Just a further point very briefly. One of the things that impressed me in the presentation last week is that, of course, it's not simply a resource you can move around within the health service, because the discipline and training between youth psychologists, adult psychologists and elderly adult psychologists are not always transferable. And so it is a much more complicated issue to address than just simply saying we'll divert the resource from and move the psychologists from one group to another.
Thank you, colleagues. In summary, we are we are continuing this petition to seek further information from the Scottish Government. The fourth current petition is PE 1441 by David Crichton on flood insurance problems. Members, a note by the clerk and the submissions. Again, I think this was a very interesting petition. It's obviously very relevant across the whole of the UK. We've seen quite considerable and quite unusual flood events. What concerned me was that the arrangement between the UK government and the insurance industry, which effectively underwrites houses that are on flood zones, is up for renewal. I think it's May or June this year. So this is obviously a very, very relevant issue. And obviously Scottish Government is inputting to that in its dialogue with the UK Government. But clearly the prospects of not having this agreement would mean the insurance industry would not insure thousands and thousands of people across Scotland who are on flood zones. A particular point, I'm not sure, maybe the clerk can keep me right here, but I'm not sure we've had a resolution to this, but David Crichton said that there was Scottish Parliament legislation which said that if your house was built on a flood zone and it had been agreed by planning and the developer obviously built the house and it then flooded, they then could be sued. But there was no cases currently that this was outstanding. It seemed a quite interesting development. It would be good to actually get some clarity on that particular point. So this is, I think, a very, very relevant and very interesting petition. As you know, there's a suggestion that we continue this petition and monitor the new commercial licence, which will enable data in the Scottish Flood Defence Asset Database to be stored with the insurance industry. and there's a suggestion that we consider this post-Easter recess, by which time we should have that quite technical and quite useful information. Angus MacDonald?
Yes, thanks, Convener. I certainly agree with your comments. I was encouraged when I read the papers by the response from the Environment Minister and SEPA. I understand that SEPA has written to all local authorities seeking their permission to share the data they provide to the Scottish Flood Defence Asset Database, and I certainly see no reason why local authorities shouldn't, all 32 local authorities shouldn't agree to do that. Given your previous comments, I would certainly agree that we should consider the petition further after the Easter recess.
Jackson Carlow?
Thank you, Minister. There was one point I seem to feel we've lost track of, and I'm not sure whether it's just that I've failed to keep pace with it. But one of the points the petitioner made was that planning had, in Scotland, prevented further development taking place on floodplain lands, but in England it had continued on such land apace, and in consequence there was the implication that a national insurance policy was perhaps being cross-subsidised in Scotland because there were more properties south of the border as a consequence of planning affecting the overall level of premiums. And there was a suggestion that that was a matter that hopefully ministers would represent in any discussions within which they were participating. And I'm not sure if we've managed just to pursue that point to a resolution from my perspective.
I think that was a very fair point. I think we did get some information back. Can I ask the clerk if you can circulate that information round to members, and we can obviously discuss this when it comes back, assuming members are agreeable, post-Easter. I mean, obviously it goes without saying that concerns about climate change have obviously accelerated this worries and concerns. But I think this is a very, very important issue for us to look at longer term. Do other members wish to contribute?
Just on the point that Jackson Carlow made. I mean, I think in one of the letters it said something about SEPA sharing the database with the insurance industry, but only for non-commercial purposes, which makes a nonsense of the point that Jackson Carlow has raised, that there would appear to be no fairness in the system unless the insurance companies enjoy the use of the database for commercial purposes.
And I think obviously there's a responsibility on our planning authorities. Obviously there's a responsibility on our on our developers. But certainly my own experience when I've witnessed firsthand really difficult flood events in the Clawdon part of Inverness is you were talking about a 1 in a 90 year possibility of flooding, where you wouldn't, in all fairness, by definition, normally expect that to happen on a regular basis and happen 2 or 3 times. We managed to resolve that, but that purely was about extensive increased drainage just to stop this event happening again. So I think there is huge issues that we need to look at this particular issue, and I would certainly suggest that we look at this issue again after Easter. Are members agreeable? Thank you. The fifth current petition is PE 1452 by Vince Mills on the People's Charter. Members have a note by the clerk and the submissions. Again, I think we had a very useful presentation by Vince Mills and his colleagues. There's still, I think, some information that we need to get further reviews from Scottish Government, and I think we're still missing, this is a familiar story to members, we're still missing some feedback from a couple of organisations. I think one's COSLA and one's CBI Scotland. Again, I feel in terms of having a comprehensive view, I personally would rather have all the organisations back before we make a next step decision on this.
Well,
Chip Brodie?
I think I made my views reasonably clear at the time that a lot of the things that were being asked for are already within the administration's programme. I just didn't understand why the petition was raised, and I still feel that. And my view is, I don't know, we can go round and round and round the information loop, but I think a lot of the questions that have been raised by the petitioner are within the administration programme.
I'm sure when we come to dispose of the petition finally that Chip Brodie will probably have a very similar view, unless of course there's quite a radical difference from the responses that we're still awaiting. John Wilson.
Convener, I agree to keep the petition open, firstly, and declare that as a signature to the petition, I support the petition or the issue for me would be, I think it is important that we get the responses from CBI Scotland and COSLA before we write to the Scottish Government, because I think we need to have comprehensive responses to the petition before we write to the Scottish Government again. But just because if we write to the Scottish Government now without the COSLA and CBI Scotland response, then we may have to then end up writing to the Scottish Government again in response to the answers or issues raised by CBI Scotland and COSLA. And I'm particularly interested in hearing from CBI Scotland, because the petition does raise, and the Charter raises a number of issues that relate directly to issues that the CBI, no doubt CBI Scotland have reported on in the past and will no doubt want to respond in the future. So it would be interesting to get their responses before we write to the Scottish Government. So could I suggest we keep the petition open, write to CBI Scotland and COSLA, ask for the responses and consider these at a later date and before we write back to the Scottish Government.
Okay, I can bring in other members and I'll bring you back, Mr Brodie. Other members wish to... Chip Brodie?
Right. The point that's been made, in fact, just been made by John Wilson, is underlines why I think this thing should be closed. We will get a standard reply from the CBI. We will get a standard reply from COSLA, and it just along the lines that when they've made representations about the budget or other stances that the administration has taken, and I'm not sure where this adds value.
Jackson Carroll?
I'm very much in support of the view that Chick Brodie expresses. I think in its scope, in a way, the petition is just so overwhelmingly broad-brushed that what we'll end up with is a forest of paperwork. But if the majority of the committee would like to dispose of it on the basis of a forest of paperwork, well then, fair enough. But I can't see ultimately that we'll do anything more with it than that.
I mean, I take the member's point, but my general view is that, if petitioners take a lot of time and effort to put a petition forward, we're only doing them justice if we ensure that we're doing it in a comprehensive and fair way. And I think what we try to do with all petitioners is go to the extra mile and ensure that every single piece of information we know about it is before us before we make a decision. I'm obviously realistic. I mean, I know the strength of Chip Brodie's views on this issue, but there'll still be a time for a day in court, Mr Brodie, when this comes before us.
Yeah, with all due respect, I mean, I think I understand what the petitioners put a lot of time into it, but I think they might take some counsel before they embark on the amount of work that they have to do.
Yeah. Sure. Can I just bring in other members? Adam Ingram, can I ask for your view on this?
I think I'd always like to see the correspondence completed before we actually move a petition forward. So I think I would agree with Mr Wilson in this instance.
Angus MacDonald?
Yeah, I can see the merits in both arguments. However, I would agree with Adam Ingram that given we have requested responses from CBI Scotland and COSLA and they haven't yet arrived, I think it would be premature to close the petition prior to receiving any information from them. So I think it would be unfair to close it at this moment in time.
Anne McTaggart?
Thanks, Convener. I'm sure this was part of the e-petition system. There's a lot of signatures involved. I think it's important that we do see it through thoroughly, and to enable us to do that, I think we've got to look at all the information that has been requested before we then decide what happens with the petition.
Thank you. So on balance, we will continue to seek information from CBI Scotland and COSLA and consider this issue again. The sixth current petition is PE 1456 by Scott Anderson, an introduction of an individual licence to purchase tobacco products. Member of a note by the clerk and the submissions. Currently, as you'll know, reading through it, there was a very, very clear response that Scottish Departments have no plans at all to introduce a licensing scheme. I think we have had all the information back on this particular petition. So because of that, I would argue that we have no choice but to close under Rule 15.7. All agreed? Thank you. The seventh current petition is PE 1457 by Alec Hamilton on Scotland's national tree. Members have a note by the clerk in the submissions. Again, I think this is a very interesting, well-researched petition. I would suggest that we continue this until the Scottish Government response is received and the results of the Woodland Trust public vote sent to the committee. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense to know exactly how the public perceive this. So I think it's a very interesting petition, but let's wait until we get the final information. Yep. Jackson Carlo.
I would quite like to know as well, when we receive the outcome of that Woodland Trust public vote, what efforts were made to publicise the vote to the wider public. Because I'm not certain that, I mean, I would like to know how representative a vote it is of the public, if in inverted commas, when we see the results of it, okay, if we're making any decisions based on it.
Thank you for that comment. The eighth and final petition is PE 145. Sorry, can I just go back? John
to the last bit. Can I seek clarification, Commissioner? Are we agreeing to write to the Scottish Wildlife Trust, of which I declare I'm a member of, to seek clarification in terms of the issues raised by Jackson Carlo? So, sorry, the Woodlands Trust, to seek clarification on how they are conducting this questionnaire and response, because I think Jackson Carlo has raised a very interesting point about who is being notified of this and how are the public being engaged in this process, and whether or not they, we think the manner in which they determine the results will be able to stand up to some scrutiny.
Well, I would suggest we right now and say to them we want to make sure that as many members of the public know about this vote as possible, and it's Jackson Carlo's point, so I think we should do that immediately. Right. Are happy with that?
Yep.
Right. Okay. Can I just move on then? The eighth and final current petition is PE 1458 by Peter Chirby on the register of interest for members of Scotland's judiciary. Members have note by the clerk and the submissions. I'm sure, like other members, that I've looked through this in a great deal of detail. This is actually a very interesting petition. The members will probably be aware that the current petition, the current position which the Lord President, I think, outlined, is if a sheriff or judge faces a conflict in a case, for example, he or she plays, golf with the accused, and as with the New Zealand case, that the judge allegedly owed some money to one of the lead defence lawyers, which has triggered one issue off. They have the ability to recuse, which basically means that they can disqualify themselves for that particular case. The issue that the Lord President and the Scottish Government have said is that they have no plans to introduce any changes. The two positions are the Scottish Government could change the law around this, in other words, create a standards register that we have to comply with, and MPs have to comply with, and ministers have to comply with, or the Lord President can introduce administrative changes to the rules. So either is a possibility if the Government or the Lord President were so minded. Neither are so minded. The petitioner, I think, put quite an interesting argument forward to say that, well, there's no real evidence here. I mean, how many judges are declaring an interest in recusing during the course of a case, or are there any judges holding a case in which they've got an interest and are not declaring an interest? So that, I think, is the way it was divided out. But also what the petitioners argued is that lots of other public groups have to have a registered interest. Why are judges any different? So this is it's quite a difficult sort of dilemma, because the people who are trying to change are quite clear there's not going to be any change. But it goes back to my earlier point that we've always had a good tradition in this committee of going the extra mile for every single petitioner. Is there any more information that we need from particularly the Lord President? For example, how many judges have recused themselves and how effective is the system? We don't actually know that piece of information. There is a wider issue. Some of the tabloids have reported that there's been judges with convictions, for example, and the issue which may come up in future petitions are issues around, if, for example, there are, they've got a Masonic interest, are they declaring it? And the final point before I throw it open to members is there's probably three areas where judges already have quite solid background. There's the judicial oath, there's the statement of principles, and then there's the judiciary legislation of 2008. So there's some areas which judges already have to comply with, which would set against the registration of interest. So hopefully that's a reasonable summary before I throw it open to members. Jackson Carlow?
Thank you, Convener. When you said the judge could play golf, I mean, I'm sure you wouldn't want to discriminate. He could be playing darts, five-a-side football, or going out clubbing with the accused as well. I think if we're being entirely reasonable in those circumstances. I have to say, when I first saw this petition, I wasn't terribly impressed with it, but actually I'm more impressed as a consequence of the responses that we've received. And the student anarchist in me slightly smells the whiff of vested interests closing doors and backs being slapped in an effort to shut the whole matter down. In fact, the protest was so great that, as Lady Macbeth methinks the Lord President doth protest too much. I would very much like us to commission an evidence session and invite the Lord President, if that's within our competence, and other vested interests who believe we should close this down, to justify their position to the committee. And I think that since it's quite clear no other area is examining this at the present time, I think that on behalf of the petitioner, this is an issue that maybe should be aired in public rather than just in writing.
Well, I think that's a very interesting development. And just to answer the technical point, yes, it's perfectly competent for us to invite Lord Gill. Can I ask him?
When I read this, I couldn't agree more with Jackson Carlow. When I looked at the Lord President's letter and it said unintended consequences, the introduction of such a register could also have unintended consequences. Consideration requires to be given to judges' privacy and freedom from harassment by aggressive media or hostile individuals. Now, if you want to take out judges and put in politicians there, then fine. Why are they any different? And I agree. We should have the representation of the Lord President or Lord Advocate or all of them, as Jackson Carlow suggests. Have them here.
Thank you, Mr. Brodie. Comments from other colleagues? John Wilson?
Convener, I think Jackson Carlow has came out with a very good suggestion that we actually have Lord Gill along to committee to explain the reasons why he has written in response in the way that he has. And I think it's, in fairness to the petitioner did respond in a strong manner, and I think the response from the petitioner would have encouraged me to write again to the Scottish Government and to Lord President to seek clarification as to how confident they are that the current system is above reproach and that judges and others do recuse themselves when they know someone who is appearing in front of them either as a solicitor, advocate, QC, or as the person charged with an offence. So it would be, I think, extremely useful not only for the petitioner, but I think for this committee and the Parliament to have Lord Gill along to, unless as Jackson received the response from Lord Gill already in terms of the issue. But I think it would be good for the Parliament and good for this committee if we did invite Lord Gill and others along to give account as to why they think there is no need for any action at the present moment.
Ms MacDonald?
When I came in to the committee this morning, I hadn't expected the debate to go down this route. However, now that Jackson Carlow has suggested that Lord Gill should appear in front of the committee, I think it's an excellent suggestion. And it would also be helpful if we could get further information on the legislation that's been proposed in New Zealand to further look at that.
Just that triggers my point, Mr MacDonald, that I think there was 10 very useful points developed in New Zealand to weigh up whether it was necessary to introduce any further controls, in inverted commas. So I would certainly suggest, if members haven't already looked at these 10 points, they are familiar with these before we take Lord Gill in at the next appropriate meeting. Are there colleagues that haven't spoken, perhaps? So, and the sense of the meeting then is that there... Sorry.
I know that the petitioner called for a register of pecuniary interests of Judges' Bill. I'm not too sure it should be... The investigation should be limited just to that. And then we look at the total register of interests that judges may have. I don't know whether that's competent or not, but...
Yes, well, I think that's a perfectly fair point that we can raise with Lord Gill when he appears. But I would suggest that members look very closely at what's happening in New Zealand. There's more to it than just New Zealand, because the petitioner himself made that point, but I do think we need to focus on that. Are members agreeable then that we'll continue this petition, and we'll invite the Lord President, and he may wish to take some colleagues with him, and the clerk will arrange this for an appropriate meeting in the future? Is that agreeable? Thank you for that. As agreed on agenda item 1, the committee will now go into private session for the final agenda item of today's meeting, and are allowed just a few minutes, and are suspended for 2 minutes to allow members